Welcome back to Arise News Hour. I'm Charles Anyagulu. Now, if you know anything about Jamaican and Caribbean history, and indeed African history, then you must know about the Maroons and the sovereign state of Accompong, a semi-autonomous region state within the state of Jamaica. Accompong is located in the hills of St. Elizabeth Parish in Jamaica, where the local terrain enabled escaped African slaves known as Maroons to establish a fortified stronghold in the 17th century. They defended it against Spanish and later British forces, who signed a treaty with them in 1739, granting them autonomy within Jamaica with certain rights for limited self-government. Since independence in 1962, the government of Jamaica has continued to recognize Maroon indigenous rights in the area. Well, recently the African Union decided to establish its African Union diaspora headquarters in Accompong, and the territory's finance minister, Timothy McPherson, has been on an official visit to Nigeria, aiming to strengthen ties between Africa and the Caribbean. Well, I'm delighted to say that the Honourable Timothy McPherson joins me now here in the studio. Thank you very much indeed for coming in. Just give us a very brief historical sketch of who the Maroons are and how they resisted the British more than 250 years ago.
Well, indeed, first and foremost, within our legacy, we pride ourselves as being the oldest sovereign members of the African family within the diaspora. So having gained our autonomy in 1739, we've basically been free 250 years before Ghana ever received its autonomy. And that was, in a time when we were being oppressed in those slave fields, in those sugarcane fields, under the shackles and chains. Our Maroon ancestors had the fortitude to take on the British, to take them to the high mountains where they knew that they had a strategic advantage, as it were, and of course defeated them unequivocally. They slaughtered the British, indeed.
That's an extraordinary piece of history, because I've been fascinated with Maroon history myself. I mean, I know that it's the Blue Mountains, isn't it? That's where the fight took place.
Well, indeed, there's 4 Maroon communities on the island today. Right. So within the Blue Mountains, what you see is the Moortown Maroons, and you also have the Scots Hall or Cushtown Maroons and the Charlestown Maroons. And then the Accompong Maroons, so we distinguish between the Windward and the Leeward Maroons.
Right.
So the Windward Maroons are what you have within the Blue Mountains, and then within St. Elizabeth, that's where you have the Accompong Maroons.
Right. And do you see your ancestors as vindicated today, what they did all those years ago, rebelling against the British and the Spanish?
1,000%. I mean, at that time, you have to ask yourself, what were they fighting for? It wasn't just about fighting against having been enslaved. It was fighting for the African culture and the African identity that colonial powers were seeking to take away from them. So in that context, today, we are 1,000% vindicated by the fact that the African Union has looked to the Maroon community and has said, this is Africa in the heart of the Caribbean.
And presumably you welcome that move because I saw a report that said the African Union had decided to establish its African Union diaspora headquarters in Accompong, which is your sovereign state. Presumably you welcome that move.
Indeed, we more than welcome that. I mean, that is a complete vindication and acknowledgement to the culture and traditions that we as Maroons have celebrated for more than 250 years.
And you talk about the culture, because it is a very African culture, very African environment there in Jamaica. Do you actually know which parts of Africa your ancestors came from?
Well, I personally am a descendant of the Moortown Maroons, which is what you refer to within within Portland and the Blue Mountains. And what we do know is that from 1650 to 1720, almost all slaves destined to the island of Jamaica were held within Fort Cormontine, today known as Fort Amsterdam within Ghana. So by being able to track ourselves back to Fort Cormontine in the west coast of Ghana, we recognize that a large partition of the African slaves that came at that time came from within the Ashanti region, and those who are around the Fort Cormontine area, which is in Cape Coast, Ghana, came from within the Cape Coast region as well.
Right. So what status do you have, you being sort of Accompong, have at the moment in Jamaica? And how are the people of Accompong sort of treated there? I mean, are you in a position, for instance, to establish control and rights over your territory? Because, I mean, after all, you are within and surrounded by the nation and the country, the independent country of Jamaica.
Well, you know, and I'm going to correct you on the last part of the statement you made, because you talked about the independent country of Jamaica. We must always keep in mind that the Queen of England is still the head of state of Jamaica.
That is true.
So on the one hand,
so Jamaica is not actually a republic,
Jamaica,
but it is an
not
independent state. Yes.
It's an independent state for which the Queen remains the crown therein. And for the Maroons, we regard ourselves as a autonomous, sovereign African peoples in the heart of that colonial franchise, as it were.
So the reason I ask that is that I wonder, I mean, you're the Minister of Finance of Accompong. I mean, is the territory able to engage in diplomatic relations with other independent countries and to make money from your land as you see fit? I mean, or do you pay taxes to the Jamaican government, for instance?
Well, in addressing the first question, I mean, we have gone the last 250 years as a kind of, I don't want to use the word dormant, but, you know, a traditional environment and somewhat enclosed. And in this 21st century, we recognize that our legacy, our culture, and our tradition is something that needs to be brought to the global stage, and that certainly the diaspora, as well as the African family on the continent, needs to be reminded of. We need to be reminded of our victories and our successes in history. And the Maroon legacy is part of that success. Now, with regards to our relation with Jamaica and our autonomy, within our territories, we are indeed able, doing whatever it is that...
well, that's good enough for me. So tell us about the purpose of your visit to Nigeria and who you've been meeting here.
Well, certainly this trip to Abuja has been absolutely splendid. The reception since I've been here has been wonderful. Nigeria has taken an interesting step in terms of launching its own Black History Month. And that was actually inaugurated this week. We had the Martin Luther King family having joined us here in Abuja, and your Office of the Presidency Diaspora Division under the Honorable Abike Dubiri Orewa has done a phenomenal job in terms of mobilizing diasporic activities to, and when I say the diaspora, I mean the traditional diaspora. So she's engaged Jamaica proper in terms of mobilizing the diaspora to re-engage Nigeria, and that has been endorsed by your president. So we had the privilege and the honor of engaging His Excellency yesterday as well. And ultimately, my focus has been to assess the terrain in terms of not only meeting the political personalities in Nigeria, but meeting our brethren and sistren, the African family.
The real sort of man on the street, or man and woman on the street.
Indeed.
So we haven't got that much time left. What message do you have for the people of Africa? And is that message different for sub-Saharan Africa than it is for the rest of the continent?
Well, I would hazard to say that for the diaspora, it's not our agenda to entertain the divide and conquer psychology in terms of describing sub-Saharan Africa in contrast to Northern Africa, as it were. So the continent is the continent, Africa is Africa, and in terms of the message, it's the recognition that Region 6, the diaspora, is the future in terms of, that relationship between the continent and the diaspora. That is the future. We waited 500 years to be able to re-engage the continent in an economic dynamic, in a cultural dynamic, in a knowledge transfer dynamic, so that in this 21st century, in this 2018, we have this opportunity before us to forge a new era of cooperation between continental Africa, and all of those living in the diaspora to lift our people forward in this 21st century.
Well, on that very bucolic note, I want to say thank you very much
Can
indeed.
I
Very,
plug an
very
address?
briefly,
Very
because
briefly,
we're out
please,
of time.
we want the diaspora to be able to register themselves at auwashingtondc.org. Simply go to that address, auwashingtondc.org, register themselves, and become part as of the diaspora.
Brilliant. The Honourable Timothy McPherson, the Minister of Finance for the sovereign state of Accompong in Jamaica. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you kindly, Charles.